They made one mistake at work, and at the time, it didn't look dramatic. No shouting, no slammed doors, no headlines. Just a quiet decision made in a glass conference room on the 32nd floor, while my name sat in the middle of a slide labeled Operational Risk. I didn't know about that meeting yet. I was downstairs at my desk, finishing a report I had stayed up until 3:17 a.m. to perfect, because that was the kind of employee I was. The kind who believed that if you worked hard enough, stayed honest enough, and kept your head down long enough, merit would eventually protect you. I was wrong. At exactly 9:06 a.m., my access card stopped working. At first, I thought it was a glitch. It happens sometimes after system updates. I tried again. Red light. Again. Red light. The security guard at the desk didn't even look surprised. He just glanced at his screen, then at me and said, "HR, will be with you shortly." That was the moment my stomach dropped, not from fear, but from recognition. Somewhere deep inside, I already knew what this meant. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in a small white room with no windows, a bottle of water I didn't touch, and two people across the table who refused to meet my eyes. One was from HR. The other was legal. They used words like restructuring, alignment, strategic direction. They told me my role was being eliminated effective immediately. They told me this had nothing to do with performance. They told me I would receive a severance package if I signed the papers in front of me. They told me my system access had already been revoked for security reasons. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that the mistake they just made wasn't firing me. The mistake was assuming I was powerless. I asked one question, just one. Who approved this? There was a pause. A subtle one, but I noticed it. Then the legal representative said, "This decision came from the executive level." That was vague on purpose. I nodded, closed the folder, and said, "I'll review this with my attorney." The HR representative stiffened slightly. That reaction told me more than anything else had. They escorted me to my desk to collect my things. A box, 15 minutes. A security guard standing just far enough away to pretend he wasn't watching me. Co-workers stared at their screens like eye contact itself might get them in trouble. A few looked genuinely uncomfortable. One looked relieved. No one spoke. As the elevator doors closed behind me, I felt something unexpected, not anger, not panic, but clarity. Because what they didn't know was this. For the past 14 months, I hadn't just been doing my job. I had been quietly fixing problems no one else was qualified or willing to touch. Problems involving delayed disclosures, misclassified assets, a subsidiary no one talked about, operating just close enough to the edge of compliance to be profitable, but far enough to be dangerous. I had flagged the issues internally. Repeatedly, I had emails, meeting notes, risk assessments. I had been told, more than once, to stop digging and trust leadership. And then, 3 weeks before they fired me, something changed. I was removed from one project, then another. My reports stopped getting responses. Meetings I had always been invited to suddenly moved without me. They thought they were containing a problem. What they were actually doing was concentrating it. By noon, I was sitting in my car in the parking garage, box in the passenger seat, phone buzzing non-stop with unread messages. I ignored all of them and made one call instead. Not to Alauia, not to my family, to a number I had saved months earlier but hoped I would never need. When the call connected, I said one sentence. They just terminated me, and everything we discussed is now urgent. There was a pause on the other end. Then a calm voice replied, "Understood. Don't contact anyone else. We're activating the file." At that exact moment, inside the building I had just been locked out of, executives were congratulating themselves. They believed they had removed a liability. They believed the risk was gone. They believed the story would end quietly. They were wrong, because firing me wasn't a mistake. Silencing me was. And by the end of the day, that mistake would expose a chain reaction worth $2 billion, unravel careers, trigger investigations, and turn the people who signed my termination papers into names whispered in courtrooms instead of boardrooms. They just didn't know it yet. By 1:30 p.m. I was no longer an employee. But the file was no longer dormant either. What most people don't understand about corporate disasters is that they don't begin with explosions. They begin with permissions, access, authority, and the quiet belief that the person you pushed out won't be believed. The moment my termination went through, internal controls shifted. Safeguards designed to require dual oversight suddenly relied on assumptions instead. The executives didn't realize it, but they had just removed the one person who understood how fragile their structure really was. At 2:04 p.m., the first automated alert triggered not inside the company, but outside it. A compliance anomaly tied to an offshore vehicle that had been temporarily reclassified. Months earlier, that reclassification was something I had flagged twice. It had been dismissed as immaterial. It wasn't. It was the hinge holding an entire risk model together. And without me there to quietly correct downstream effects, the system began doing exactly what it was designed to do. When inconsistencies appeared, report them. By 3:10 p.m., external auditors requested clarification. By 3:42 p.m., the general counsel was pulled into a call he hadn't scheduled. By 4:18 p.m., a regulator opened a preliminary inquiry, not an investigation yet, but the kind that makes phones stop ringing and rooms go silent. Inside the executive suite, confusion set in. Someone asked why this wasn't caught internally. Someone else said it had been. Someone finally asked my name. At 5:07 p.m., my phone buzzed for the first time since I'd left the garage. A text from a former colleague. "Are you watching the news?" I wasn't. I didn't need to. I already knew where this was going. Because the offshore structure wasn't isolated. It connected to a financing arrangement, used to support a pending acquisition, one that had been touted internally as transformational. The valuation hinged on representations that were now suddenly under scrutiny. By 6:30 p.m., the acquiring firm paused the deal. By 7:12 p.m., analysts began revising projections. By 8:01 p.m., the board convened an emergency session. The word liability appeared again, this time next to a number no one had expected to see attached to it. $2 billion. That was the exposure if the deal collapsed under regulatory pressure. That was the number attached to unwind costs, penalties, litigation reserves, and market reaction. That was the price of assuming silence equaled safety. By nightfall, executives who had signed my termination hours earlier were being asked to explain decisions they hadn't thought anyone outside the building would ever examine. At 9:46 p.m., I received an email from an unfamiliar address. Short, careful, polite. "We'd like to discuss a potential misunderstanding regarding your departure." I didn't reply. At 10:15 p.m., another arrived. Then a call. Then a voicemail. The tone shifted quickly from procedural to urgent to conciliatory. By midnight, they weren't trying to manage optics anymore. They were trying to survive consequences. Here's the part they never anticipated. I didn't want revenge. I wanted distance. I had already done what I needed to do by telling the truth when it mattered, documenting what others preferred to blur, and refusing to be the quiet fix behind loud decisions. The system didn't collapse because I pushed it. It collapsed because it had been balanced on assumptions instead of integrity. 3 weeks later, the deal officially unraveled. The market reacted. Investigations expanded. Leadership changed. Statements were issued that said a lot without admitting anything. I was never mentioned by name. I didn't need to be. The record spoke for itself. People ask me now if I planned it, if I knew firing me would trigger all of it. The answer is no. I just knew that pretending problems don't exist doesn't make them disappear. It makes them compound. The mistake wasn't underestimating me. The mistake was underestimating reality. They locked me out at 9 a.m. By night, $2 billion had changed hands without a single deal closing. And the lessons spread quietly through every boardroom that heard the story afterward. The most dangerous person in the room isn't the loud one. It's the one who understands the system and walks away from it honestly.